Hello, and welcome to Your Estate Matters with your hosts, my colleague Greg Brenand and myself, Nicole Garten of Heritage Trust.
Your Estate Matters is a podcast dedicated to everything estates, including building and preserving your legacy.
If it's estate related, we'll be talking about it. We're having the conversations today that will help Canadians protect their families, their assets, and their legacies tomorrow.
Tegan, thanks for being with us here today to talk about real estate investing as part of a family wealth building strategy. Tell us about yourself and your journey to your current role as the CEO of Channel Consulting and founder of Uplift Fund.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I started my career 26 years ago as an urban planner, and my expertise is really in housing development and government relations. So I spent most of the early part of my career working in government. And so that's where I really built my relationships. And then I went over to a private equity firm as a director of development, and I was looking after about 35 assets in Western Canada. At the same time, I was doing a ton of volunteer work, doing advocacy. So I was the chair of an industrial land committee in Metro Vancouver that was informing the regional industrial land strategy development. I was on the building committee for the Salvation Army's 9 Stories of Hope, a trustee for Christchurch Cathedral, on the partnership committee for BC Children's Hospital. And all of these things happening at the same time, really, I realized I'm actually really good at connecting people and ideas to make projects happen. So I realized, okay, actually I'm really good at this. What kind of business could I start on my own that leverages that gift that I have? And so I started Channel Consulting in 2019, at the end of 2019. So 5 years ago. And so in the beginning, my existing employer, I had a couple of projects with them. So I started with clients. And nobody foresaw the pandemic coming. Interest rates dropped and people were acquiring property like crazy. So 2020 was an amazing year to actually be starting a business for me because we did so many development feasibility studies for all types of property owners. So for REITs, private developers, nonprofit groups, families, really a broad range. We did these studies for. And we got incredible feedback from investment committees in some of the largest REITs in Canada. And so that's really how we built our process and our templates, was with this incredible feedback. So the feedback we get now, 5 years in, is that we have the best process and the best studies, that there's nothing like it in BC. So I'm super proud of that. So the first step in working with us is always those development feasibility studies. That's really our niche. And then depending on what those studies reveal and depending on how sophisticated the group is, we are also hired to do the approvals, which includes really navigating policy, trying to advocate for solutions that help beat the clock and costs on project approvals. So it's been a really rewarding 5 years in terms of impact. It's also a very difficult business to be in the current climate in Canada, for sure.
So tell us about the current climate. What's going on with the real estate landscape right now in BC and Canada?
Yeah. So Canada and BC is a really difficult place for real estate investment right now. As we all know, we're in the housing crisis. We have, overkill in terms of land use policy. We have dysfunctional permitting processes. We have an infrastructure crisis. And so it's, really difficult to make projects pencil at this time in Canada. The other reality is land economics. It costs about $1 million to build an apartment in the Lower Mainland. So 120 apartments, an 20-story building, $120 million. And so the only groups that really have the pockets deep enough to build those projects are the pension funds.
Mm-hmm.
And they are accountable to their defined benefit pensioners,
Mm-hmm.
the nurses, the teachers. And they can't make the economics work on projects. And so those investments aren't happening in this market. The reality is those pension funds are starting to take more of a global view, and we're seeing those investments leave Canada, go into USA and other markets. So the current landscape, if you own land, so if you're a long-term landholder, a family with generational holdings, it's actually a great time to go ahead and get your sites entitled, because when things change, there will be an appetite for sites that have been through the approvals process. But right now, it's really difficult to make the economics work. That's for sure.
So where are the investing opportunities now?
Yeah, so great question. As I mentioned, really what I'm hearing from clients, prospective clients, number one is just really thinking globally. So people have their heads up and they are looking south of the border. People tend to, feel more comfortable investing in North America. And also there are sophisticated groups that are taking a global perspective. There are, plenty of jurisdictions around the world that are more business friendly than British Columbia or Canada currently. So that's a challenge, but it's a trend as well that we're seeing that capital take that path. The second trend, which whether it's in BC or Canada or anywhere globally, is transit-oriented development. And what I personally love about transit-oriented development is that trains and transit love corridors, but pipes and fiber and energy love corridors too. So transit-oriented development is super efficient for infrastructure, so for building housing at scale, but also for servicing things like data centers that require, a lot of water and a lot of fiber and a lot of energy. So number one, think globally. Number two, transit-oriented sites are just awesome. And then the third one really is looking at ways to use land more intensively. So again, I use the data center example, very efficient way to use industrial land. And then student housing, where you have things like shared kitchens. And so with this trend of going away to college, which used to be sort of an American or a North American thing, it's become a global thing. This is a global trend as well, is adding student housing around the world. And the kids do international exchanges and all of these things. They are all putting pressure on this type of use, but also creating a lot of opportunities for that type of use as well.
So what do you mean by transit-oriented housing? Do you mean it's close to a bus line, or what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, so transit-oriented development is typically rail-based transit, so the SkyTrain, Canada Line, that type of service. But it can be bus rapid transit. But generally, it's a dedicated transit service that's a fixed service that you can predict is going to be there, long into the future, and then building walkable communities around that. So for example, transit-oriented housing is fantastic because particularly like young people, new Canadians, early talent who's wanting to relocate, they tend to not have a vehicle, and they tend to be dual income households where they're going to be working in different locations. So you don't necessarily have a home by the office, home by somebody's office, but maybe not the other one. So transit-oriented development is very desirable for, just from a market perspective. It tends to have better absorption. But also from a building perspective, you can get a lot more certainty on your infrastructure costs when you're upgrading a corridor overall to serve transit.
How can real estate investing be used to build long-term generational wealth for families?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this word generational is kind of the heart of this question, which is this long-term idea. And so it's interesting because just last night, my daughter had her boyfriend over for dinner. And so I asked them what they thought about this question. And the thing that they said is, well, is a family home generational wealth? And I said, that's absolutely brilliant because, yeah, the first step in building wealth is buying a home. And so that family home tends to be the first step, obviously, in building generational wealth. The second step then being, when we see this typically, vacation properties.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third step, creating that income producing or development portfolio. And where the family home and the vacation properties really come in is leverage, providing that leverage, the family home and the increase in values over time to start to acquire some of those income producing properties and assets. And with the vacation properties, there can be really exciting opportunities for subdivision and so forth that allows unlocking value over time through land banking. So I think that the key really is starting somewhere, building those assets, and then looking for those cash flow positive income producing properties. Again, it starts somewhere. It could be, starting off with an apartment portfolio. It could be shopping centers and rental apartment buildings. But basically, the key is just to get in, and then knowing with the income producing properties what the exit is. What is the long-term strategy for this asset? Is it a redevelopment asset? If it's a shopping center, there can be really exciting opportunities to joint venture through redevelopment and continue to hold those commercial retail assets for future generations.
So how do you start to diversify this? So I'm hearing the family home, maybe a vacation property, maybe apartments, and then I guess as wealth accrues, you can start doing more substantial things. Like what is an effective diversification strategy to mitigate risk?
Yeah, this is like a really great question, right? Because there's how to be well diversified in real estate in Canada, where we have such high barriers to entry in terms of land costs. And then there's sort of the question around, there's the rich and then there's the ultra rich. So what does diversification look like really varies on, how much money you have. But certainly the long-term kind of goal being to have a mix of income producing and development properties, residential, commercial, industrial exposure, diversified in that regard. And then, of course, with really good tax advice, looking at opportunities, across the border and globally, where the barriers to entry from a capital perspective are just significantly lower.
Well, how can real estate investing complement other wealth building strategies like stock market investing or business ownership?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So it's interesting because BMO actually did a study last year, which was really fascinating. And they looked at the stock market versus Canadian real estate over the last 34 years. And what they found is that the S&P TSX composite had an average annual return of 7.9% over the 34 years, whereas Toronto real estate in the same period was 7.8% and Regina was 4.2%. So whereas real estate is more stable over time and the stock market is more volatile, and of course there's different tax implications in terms of capital gains and primary residence and so forth to take into account, the two performed relatively comparatively, but with different types of risk profile. In terms of this third complementary wealth building strategy that you mentioned of business ownership, there's kind of different aspects of business ownership. My husband and I are both entrepreneurs. So when I think of business ownership, I think of personal business ownership with a controlling interest. And that's where, I think that you can have the most control over your returns. But that's my view, obviously, as an entrepreneur. But I think that all three in the portfolio is really worthwhile and important for different reasons.
So how do you start getting kids involved in investing?
My experience with my clients is that they have a very difficult time having these conversations with their children. I have a lot of coffee meetings, lunches, breakfasts, phone calls with Gen 1 folks, mostly gentlemen, who in their 70s and 80s still are doing most of the heavy lifting related to their properties and don't have a succession plan in place. And what I really notice is that the attachment that they have to their properties is very personal and very emotional. They're very, very proud of these properties that they have. Generation 2, this is just being completely stereotypical, but there tends to be some knowledge from growing up around, the parent who's been building this portfolio and maybe tagging along and doing repairs with that and that type of thing. So they have an appreciation of what's gone into this. And then with Generation 3, not as much really awareness at all. So what I have found when I've been working with families is the first step is really to help take the emotion out of the conversation and to really focus on doing a really solid technical study of what they can do with the property based on the current land use policy and policy environment. And we always look at 3 scenarios. We look at a really aggressive scenario, a moderate scenario, and then kind of a status quo scenario. And so recently, we had one of our clients who included her 20-something son in one of these processes. And it was fantastic. And he made it when he could. And he asked really good questions. And it's a slow drip, right? It's the beginning of a longer term conversation about what happens with this asset. But I really believe that in terms of legacy planning involving family members, in involving them in a really technical, matter-of-fact way with the third-party advisors, extremely important.
So how do you start educating kids at a young age about these topics?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because it's kind of like this having dinner with my daughter and her boyfriend last night and telling them about the podcast and asking them about what they thought people would be interested in hearing about is sort of whetting their appetite to develop more knowledge around a topic. So I'm totally a believer in the slow drip method and also just really challenging myself to let go and to be as transparent as possible. I think it's really important just to just really challenge ourselves around trusting and sharing information, and also having the right advisors on board. So there are obviously age-appropriate conversations that you can have around assets and value and risks and opportunities. There's opportunities to involve kids in projects where you can, whatever that project might look like. All 3 of my children have worked in my business. And, my daughter who's studying engineering, she does land title searches. She's understanding land. So really fostering, where you can, those opportunities to get them involved. Foster financial literacy and strategic thinking. So there's this great book by Scott Galloway that I read last year, and now all my kids are reading it, called The Algebra of Wealth. And so, just those types of things. You can't make your child read a book, but you can suggest it. So again, it's the slow drip method, capacity building, meeting them where they are. If there's an opening, exploring that. But yeah, I think that education and mentoring it's extremely worthwhile, and it just takes some intention and thought.
Any final tips for our listeners?
Final tips for listeners. So This morning, I was actually just listening to Jordan Peterson's interview with Pierre Poilievre. It left me feeling hopeful about our country. So I'm feeling hopeful. I think that when I'm talking to all different types of clients, they have big ideas for their land. And it's really important to ground truth those ideas. And so, as I mentioned, those opportunities to find out exactly what you can do with your property and to be prepared and equipped when those major investment groups come back looking for those sites that are entitled, looking for those opportunities for joint ventures. I think it's really important to get those development feasibility studies done. Like I really believe in the work that we're doing.
So that's funny that you mentioned that interview because so Tegan and I have known each other through personally and through business, and I actually thought I listened to that as well, and I actually thought of you as I was listening to that podcast because one of the things that Mr. Poilievre discusses is the incredibly high baked-in cost, the bureaucratic and municipal cost in development, and then also the impact of our monetary policy on inflation. And given that we have such structural barriers to affordability in housing, like how do we turn this ship around? It's kind of like turning a huge freighter around.
It is going to be extremely difficult. So on the cost side, that's a whole ball of wax. What I can focus on really is the development approvals process. So we actually have one of our service offerings is to municipalities and government for the development approval process review. And we have a whole framework that we do for reviewing municipal processes. There is so much fat in municipal process. In the city of Vancouver, the average zoning application has 30 to 50 hands touch it. The opportunities are immense for process improvement, templating things, tools, moving to a professional reliance model, approved suppliers lists, leveraging AI, enormous opportunities to leverage AI. And I think we'll get there. I think it's going to take, I think it's going to be 5 to 10 years before we really see meaningful shifts in our ability to do that work because there's so much technical work that has to happen in the meantime. But I mean, I think the first step is to have a government that actually understands the complexity of land economics and that we can't just keep adding taxes and expecting growth to pay for growth. We've had a history in our country where development was able to pay for growth, and that's no longer the case in Canada. So that I left feeling inspired from the podcast. Yeah.
So you feel like we're going to have potentially a leadership change that's going to do, because I think there will be difficult changes and what is it, homeostasis, and a large bureaucratic environment is motivated to maintain itself. Isn't that true? It is.
Absolutely. It's going to be really difficult. It's going to be a really difficult thing to right size government at all levels. Yeah, 100%.
So any final tips for our listeners?
Channel Consulting has a lot of resources available to folks who are starting to think about generational wealth and real estate investing. So on our website, channelconsulting.ca, under the resources page, there are many, many webinars, master classes, roundtables that we've done to help support the industry in being more knowledgeable around the complexity around land use approvals. So definitely encourage that. We have a blog that we post every week with 1,700 followers. There's nuggets in there. We often reference some of our other industry colleagues' good work around advocacy. So I would just say, as a tip, just really if folks want to get free information, that they can tap into those resources.
Great. And so listeners can find you at
channelconsulting.ca, or on LinkedIn.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered individual legal, financial, or tax advice. Make sure to consult the advisor of your choice to advise you on your own circumstances. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your Estate Matters. If you like this podcast, make sure to follow it on your podcast platform of choice.
Whether you are planning your own estate or you're acting as executor for somebody else's, Heritage Trust can help. Partner with Heritage Trust to protect your family, your assets, and your legacy.
If you would like more information about Heritage Trust, please visit our website at heritagetrustcompany.ca.
This podcast is produced by Podfather Creative.